Welcome to The Human Experience, a podcast about the stories we live out every day and the importance of championing the vulnerability and courage of the storyteller. I'm your host, Jennifer Peterkin, and it was through my own lived story of experiencing domestic violence that this podcast was created. By traveling the globe and interviewing each guest in person, I am convinced now more than ever that stories have the power to change the world. You can join our community of storytellers by subscribing, leaving a rating and review, signing up for my newsletter, following me on Instagram, and more. Thank you for being here. In a world full of noise, to listen with intention is an act of resistance. A little over 2 years ago, The Human Experience went live. It was a terrifying moment, hitting that publish button. All of the sudden, a very real piece of my heart was up for public consumption. But it happened, and the past couple of years have been some of the most rewarding and at times exhausting of my life. It has given me a newfound appreciation for the creativity of human beings. Though we may not all create in the same way, it is something that we are made to do, and when we pursue that instinct, there is an authentic beauty that is born. But it's hard-won as well. Creating is difficult. It takes grit and dedication and can quickly become something that you no longer enjoy. When I decided I wanted to start this podcast, I spent more than a year just thinking about it. Then I spent another 2 years figuring out how to make it work. The preparation could have honestly gone on forever. It was a space that was safe. But eventually, I had to kick this project out of the nest and see if it could fly. Looking back, I'm glad that I spent so much time preparing. When I released my first episodes, I was able to release 3 right away, but I had more than a dozen already recorded. That preparation also allowed me to establish my ethos behind what I was creating. And while that has grown and changed as I have over the past 2 years, the core has ultimately stayed the same. The Human Experience was an amalgamation of the best and worst things in my life. I have always loved stories. I'm convinced they are essential to our survival. Story has, does, and will continue to come in many forms. It is a universal human language. It is through story that we connect with one another, that we find compassion and empathy and understanding. It is through story that we are moved to tears and laughter and anger. Our voices are important. And in a world with so much noise, where content is commoditized, it's difficult to feel like that's true. My hope is, and always has been, that the Human Experience is a community where people can share the vulnerable parts of themselves, where they are free to tell their story using their voice, and where people can listen without judgment and maybe find understanding and compassion towards someone or something that they hadn't had access to before. The Human Experience never has and never will be investigative, and I try to do whatever is in my power to make sure that it's not exploitative. It's important to me that anyone who chooses to share their story knows that the narrative is ultimately theirs to tell. That's why I do all of my interviews in person. From the beginning, this component was very important to me. Many podcasts are recorded online via Zoom or another similar program. And honestly, I think it's amazing. The technology that's available allows for so many wonderful things to be created that may not be otherwise. But it was a personal and intentional decision for me to interview my guests in person. Years ago, I was introduced to Bryan Stevenson's work and his book, Just Mercy. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's extremely powerful. Bryan is a lawyer and he runs the Equal Justice Initiative, so we couldn't be further apart in our fields of work. But he was the first person I had ever heard talk about justice work in conjunction with proximity, and it's never left me. I believed it then in theory, and I believe it now in practice. There is power in proximity, no matter what your work entails. So I traveled. I've interviewed people in 10 states and 9 countries, and it has truly changed my life. These past few years have been an incredible journey, wonderful and lovely and difficult and challenging, and I'm so thankful for every minute of it. Choosing to interview my guests in person was a way for me to honor them. I sit in solidarity with the narrator, and I bear witness to their story because it's inherently valuable, and I am so grateful when anyone chooses to share. Because it is a big deal, and it should be treated with care and dignity and respect. Many people wonder how I can afford to travel to do my interviews, and the answer is that I have a day job. One I'm extremely grateful for because they allow me to work remotely when I'm traveling for the podcast. But sometimes life gets crazy. Crazier than usual, I should say. For the past several months, I have not been able to travel like I normally have been, and what once was a hefty backlog has now dwindled down to nothing. So I was faced with a decision. Do I push through and get it done even if it's not my best effort, or do I make a change? A friend of mine once used the phrase, to hold something loosely, and it's something that comes to mind often. It's a practice I try to employ in my life in general, but especially for the podcast. Holding on to something tightly doesn't guarantee it will stick around, and often it may mean that you make an even bigger mess in the process. But to hold something loosely is to allow for the ebb and flow of life. It is to allow for change and growth. If you were made for something, it will not pass you by. All of this, essentially, is an extremely dramatic way of telling you that I'm changing the release schedule for the human experience, at least for the foreseeable future. I'll be releasing a guest interview every other week instead of weekly, and there may be something in the works for those off weeks, so stay tuned. Some of you may be rolling your eyes at this point at how long it took me to say something so simple, but it matters to me. The why matters, and coming to this decision was not easy. I've worked really hard to make this dream a reality, and this feels like a step in the wrong direction. But ultimately, I love being able to do this show, and I want to continue loving it for a long time. So I hope you stick with me, and I hope you feel empowered to hold things loosely as well. Thank you for listening to The Human Experience. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please subscribe, share it with your friends and family, share it on social media, and rate and review it on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. You can also support the podcast financially by going to my website, thehxpod.com, linked in the show notes, and clicking on Donate. It takes a lot of time and resources to create this podcast, so every little bit helps. Everyone has a story, and I'd love to hear yours. So be sure to check out the show notes for more information about how to stay in touch. Do good and love well.